We're going to start the session today with a special guest, Sandeep Singhal from Nexus Venture Partners. Now, Nexus is a key fund in the Indian ecosystem, and they've been around right from almost from the beginning of the evolution in the Indian startup ecosystem, and has been a major player. And we've had some time back, we've had Naren Gupta, whom I've known for many, many, many years from Nexus, and Sandeep is our second guest from Nexus, and a very, very knowledgeable person about the Indian ecosystem and how it's evolving, what is going on, and so forth. So I expect that we're going to learn a lot from Sandeep today. Sandeep, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Samana. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with some kind of basic level setting. The Indian software as a service startup scene has gone through some core realizations. India-facing SaaS is not venture fundable. It is too slow growth a market. Therefore, if you want to build a fundable company, go global. This is what we're hearing from all our venture capitalist colleagues in the Indian ecosystem. Is this your approach as well?
I would say that we started Nexus with that hypothesis. When we started in 2006, we clearly saw that if you really wanted to build a large business, particularly, at that time, the Indian buyers weren't as sophisticated, weren't spending as much money. So if you were a technology provider, you really had to build a global business. So when we set up Nexus, as you mentioned, you have had Naren on the show before. So Naren and I partnered with the idea that we would take companies from India and bring them to global markets. So Nexus has a presence both in India and the US. We have office here in Menlo Park, and we have office in Bombay and in Bangalore. And what we do is, we work with entrepreneurs that we believe can take their companies global from early on. And they have that mindset of building a business that, maybe potentially starts with India initially. They get their minimum viable product ready in India with Indian clients, but very early on in the company's growth cycle, they are taking a global view. And also from an investment perspective, we would look at these companies and compare them to their peers in the Valley or in the US or other markets, and make sure that the team that we are backing can compete with their global peers. So I would totally agree with you that this is not a recent phenomena that if you want to build a large SaaS business that you have to look global. I think this is something that entrepreneurs knew in 2005, 2006 as well. In fact, I would say today there is probably more opportunity to do SaaS in India for India. But again, tough to build very large businesses there. It will take time, as you mentioned. Growth is slow.
Slow growth. The sales cycles are so long; it just takes very long to build something.
Yeah, there's a sales cycle issue. There's also a distribution issue. To sell in India and to sell SaaS in particular across a large group of customers, it's not very well set. The marketing channels aren't well developed. You don't have very strong sort of tech product marketing in India. So there are all the things that have gotten built in the US are still early days in India.
So let's double click down on a couple of things you said. When you are evaluating a team to check for whether this team can compete in a global business mode, what are you looking for, and what have you learned to look for in terms of entrepreneurs who can actually work in a global context? Sandeep, your audio is gone.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so what I was, so if you are looking to target the global market very early on, then you have to understand the global customer need, right? So it just can't be that I'm going to build a product for India and then sell it in global markets. The product definition itself at the start has to involve talking to global customers, getting their inputs, understanding the global landscape, who else is there, it's competing, or if you are looking to, get an incumbent out, what is the incumbent doing or not doing well, and how would you position yourself vis-a-vis the incumbent. That level of thinking and understanding requires the founding team to either be, have at least somebody in market, somebody in the US, or somebody who has at least worked in global markets and has an understanding. So somebody who may have spent 2 or 3 years here and then chosen to go back, or teams that have one person in the US and one person in India. That in our view has worked better. And there are exceptional cases where people have found opportunity while sitting in India. We've seen open source as a big driver of that. People who are involved in the open source community out of India have, when they're working on projects that are global, sometimes they can see the gaps and sort of go and build a business around that. But if you're building an enterprise SaaS product, having a good understanding of how the business is operating in global markets is very important.
And same thing about MVPs. Are you then looking for early customers that are international customers that they have built an MVP around when you're evaluating a company?
Yes. So there are 2 ways to do this. One is that you can work with the Indian arms of global customers and MNCs, we call them multinational corporations. You can work with them in the India market, but have a clear understanding of how that Indian operation is aligned with global operations. So if the India operation is very India centric, then it's very hard to take what you've built for the Indian client global. And so if you are looking to go down the path of working with an Indian MNC with the idea that you will use them as a stepping stone to go global, then it's very important to understand their global operations, and working with the India team to get that input is critical. The second approach is to look at what others, like I said, what the incumbents are doing and where the gaps are, and trying and building a better product against that. And if you're building an MVP in that case, then I think it's important to get a few early customers, as alpha customers, beta customers, preferably get them involved even during the product definition stage. But if not, then getting them early on in as a SaaS company, obviously, getting some traction in global markets is very important.
So what key SaaS trends are you particularly interested in right now? Where do you see opportunities? If you were to kind of tell people that, hey, I want to invest in a company that aligns with this trend, what are those trends?
So, clearly productivity tools remain an important part of the SaaS solution. We are continuing to see that. We're seeing there's a big opportunity in SaaS tools that are sort of data-driven, that are involving data in the way that they are offering the solution to their clients. So analytics-driven SaaS platforms are a key thing. From a market perspective, there are opportunities actually pretty much across the board. We've seen opportunities in the infra play with SaaS. So we have a company called Druva that's playing over there. We have a company called Postman that's in the API space. So I think the more important thing in my mind is less the space, but really figuring out what the gap is in any of these markets.
Absolutely.
And so it ranges, and particularly if you're doing something out of India, then that becomes even more important because you're working in a market that's removed, as we discussed, from the global market.
Yeah.
So
but that's what we tell everybody is that this is 2016. The internet has been around for more than 20 years, and a lot of things have happened. Smartphones have been around for almost 10 years, so you cannot just assume that you have a open runway now. You have to really be very granular about finding where the gaps are.
Exactly. That's exactly. I think you've encapsulated what I was saying quite well. It's really the micro level, understanding where the gaps are, and just making sure that what you're building fills that in a much better way.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your portfolio. What have you invested in, and specifically why? Let's do a couple of case studies. When did the entrepreneur come to you? At what stage? With what metrics? What convinced you to invest? And what can our entrepreneurs learn from your process of evaluating their funding worthiness?
Sure. So, I mentioned this company called Postman, and Postman is providing the open source tool for API management. The company was started by Abhinav Asthana, and this is an interesting example of what I was describing, working with a local sort of global corporation in India, discovering a need and building a solution around that. So Abhinav had done an internship at Yahoo in India. And while he was working with them, he sort of realized that just managing the APIs within the Yahoo development environment itself, right? Being able to, what he was building, making sure that, whatever APIs he was publishing were, current, being used by the right team members on the other side. And then similarly, when he was using APIs that were, being worked out in Mountain View and taking them and using them in India, it was just, it was painful and it was complex. So he saw an opportunity there. He said, this is a problem that a lot of developers would be facing. So took a very developer-oriented approach and built this tool, Postman, and and did it open source. So when he came to us, it was seed stage. My colleague Samir in the Bangalore office met with him first, and really liked him. So we met with Abhinav, and the interesting thing was that he had 650,000 users, or 500,000 downloads of his product when he came and met with us, and this had been completely bootstrapped. And when we asked him, how had he done this, it was, he was one person who had built the whole thing, just working day night to make it happen. So the first thing obviously was the fact that he had identified a clear need, and this is a need that he had, not just seen himself, but post that he had validated that by building a product that 500,000 people had downloaded. And so that gave us confidence that, he understood the problem well enough. The second thing was obviously his ability to, take care of all aspects of the business. From he did the coding, he did the customer support, he was sort of the marketing guy behind this and everything else. So, when we looked at him as I said, in the context of a global entrepreneur pool, we would place him, amongst the top even in the Valley. So we said, here's a person who's sitting in India, who could be doing the same thing if he was sitting in San Francisco or Palo Alto. And so that was the key driver. We invested behind him and have subsequently helped him build out his team, get the product more enterprise friendly, team oriented, but I would say and get up enough to spend more time in the US. But I would say that from the start, it was really the comfort that Abhinav was a global entrepreneur, that he was really plugged into a global ecosystem, understood its needs, was interacting with global customers, taking feedback, fixing the product, all of that. So I think that's one example.
One thing you haven't mentioned about this company is the business model and the monetization. What validation did you have that these 500,000 downloads were actually, some percentage of that was converting into paying customers? What was the situation when they came to you?
Okay, good point. So they had actually very small sort of $10 charge for deploying their client for curl. So there was a command line interface that you could connect into Postman, and that they were charging for that, and were getting paid for it. That was one. But more importantly, we actually spoke to some of the users who were at enterprises. One of them happened to be our portfolio company. Excuse me. And we asked the VP engineering at our portfolio company that, how much would you pay for this, and what would be the value? And he said, he drew out 2 or 3 other things that he needed to make this much more, as I said, enterprise-oriented, working, for team usage and so on. And he said, if this thing if they fix all of these things, I'd be happy paying, whatever, X dollars per month per user for this. And we spoke to a couple of people in the US, people who had downloaded the software in the US at large companies here, and reached out to them, had conversations with them to understand what where they could see a product like this. So similar to what we did with our, with our portfolio company, and again got the same message that if these features were added in, they would be open to paying. One person went to the extent of saying, hey, this thing is helping my team so much that if he were to add, these features, I would pay $100 per user per month, right? So it was, it was up to that. So we were comfortable, with these, from this diligence, that there was a business model, and then also there are companies like MuleSoft and RPG and others who have been in the API space.
Yeah.
They've been more on, API monitoring, management. This was much more on the developer side, but we saw that there is an openness to paying for such tools.
So is this a trend that you are seeing, that Indian developers doing open source projects and getting to some level of scale in terms of downloads and so forth, and then going for financing? Is this happening at some degree of frequency?
Not as much as we would expect. I would have expected more of this to happen when we started Nexus in 2006, 2000. We felt that we would see a lot more solutions around open source and on-demand sort of SaaS software. We had, in the initial days, we didn't see many. The one company that we backed that did quite well was DimDim, which was open source WebEx, solution that Salesforce acquired. There is a little bit of concern, and I think it's a genuine concern that one has to sort of think through, I think you mentioned this, that how do you build a monetizable business using open source, right? So I think that's a genuine concern. Where's the paywall? Is the market that you're targeting really amenable to monetization around the open source support-led model? The second concern that we see a lot is around loss of IP. So there is a concern, paranoia you call it, that if I go open source, then others can see what I'm doing and copy it. And that's one thing that I've seen with at least open source proponents in the US, that it's sort of it's either you do it or you don't, right? It's a very clear philosophical view that I will build something in open source. I will let my IP in the public domain, but with the idea that, listen, I own it, I control it. It's important, people understand that, and it's not that people don't want to pay for open source, but I will get paid for it, and also, I will get others to contribute into it. And so, in India, we've seen at least some level of reluctance for open source because of this, fear of IP loss, and which is not as much the case in the US.
Well, we've seen fabulous companies come up using the commercial open source model, right? MuleSource is an excellent company that's really scaling phenomenally. And the other thing that I should mention in this context is there is a particular bootstrapping strategy that we espouse, which is completely contrarian to most accelerators' philosophies. They will not touch a company that's using this bootstrapping philosophy with a 10-foot pole. We do. It's bootstrapping with a paycheck. And open source actually lends itself phenomenally well to bootstrapping using a paycheck. And I've seen a lot of great companies. In fact, MuleSource was a company that came out of that bootstrapping using a paycheck mode of bootstrapping.
No, absolutely. I think there is a lot more that can be done there, and I'm hoping that over time we'll see more of that come out of India.
Do you want to talk about another portfolio company in some detail that highlights some trend that you want to talk about?
Sure. The other company I'll talk about briefly is Arkin. So Arkin is an example of a team that started cross-border. So this is a team that came out of VMware. And again, while they were there, they recognized that there was a need to address this, management issue in the software-defined networking area. So as you looked at the software-defined data center, there were various tools that were there around, managing the compute environment, but as people and virtualization, but as networks were being virtualized, there wasn't really a good solution to manage virtualized networks. And so they, the product manager, there was a team with the product manager from VMware and a head of the R&D team in India from VMware and, a senior architect. The three of them sort of left to start this company. And very clear, as I said, defined a very clear gap in the market with their knowledge of being in market. They had, so Shiv was here, Rohit was in India, and, so Rohit was able to build his team in Pune with, in a much more cost-effective manner than would have cost somebody to sort of do that in the US. So again, global understanding, global team, and, we're able to build out the product very quickly, get it to market, get the initial traction. And then, recently VMware acquired them. So, here's an example of a cross-border team from day one. In Abhinav's case, it was Abhinav in India building out something. In the Arkin case, it was really, a global team from the start. And for us,
what stage
so
did
again,
you invest in Arkin?
Yeah, so we came in at the very start. So, we effectively, seeded the company. And we expect to see more of these going forward, because it's just very efficient if the go-to-market strategy is being developed in the U.S. with team members that are based here, and the engineering and the MVP build-out and everything else is happening in India with a very strong sort of co-founder that's engineering co-founder. We've seen that in the past with Dhruva, with PubMatic, and so on.
Yes.
So we believe that that approach is, we'll see more of that from a cross-border play.
Especially in the enterprise context. The
Totally.
Companies that are selling to SMEs, global SMEs, are actually marketing and selling from India as well, and getting to further along, actually, before they choose to move to the U.S. in many cases. But that's because they don't have the cost and the overhead of enterprise sales, selling.
Yeah.
Switching the line of questioning a bit, there are rumblings that the global market for startup technology is slowing and the incumbents are overpowering the new ventures. There's a pretty large article, I think it was in the Technology Review, MIT Technology Review, on this, and I've heard that from a lot of entrepreneurs and VCs as well on the ground. What are you seeing, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the some sort of key drivers. The cost of sales, cost of building a channel. Those costs are very high, and they remain high. And the incumbents that have that legacy infrastructure and the legacy relationships do pose a big challenge for startups. And particularly companies that are coming out of India face even a bigger challenge than startups here, because the startups here typically will have team members that have been in the market and so on. So yeah, I think that issue is valid. That being said, I think there continue to be opportunities. Like I go back to my original point that this is all about finding those gaps. And those gaps have to be large enough for people to, switch to you. And once you can build similar relationships that the incumbents have with your customers, there is always an opportunity to upsell, cross-sell into that market. So you have to be a little bit more, I would say, guerrilla tactics are even more important now than earlier. The second thing that's also happening because of this is, capital is a lot more cautious coming into companies. Earlier you would say, okay, fine, I've got my MVP, I finish my, I get my initial set of customers, I'm now in Series B, now I show some scale, and then I raise a large round to do a Series C, which will allow me to build out a large sales force and marketing and sort of really go head on with the incumbents. We've seen that that model hasn't necessarily worked for everyone, and a lot of companies have struggled to scale Series C and beyond. And that there is a genuine concern in the investor community around whether these companies will IPO, they continue to burn a lot of cash, and so. That caution is causing capital to not be available for startups, which makes it more likely they'll end up in being acquired by incumbents, and so there's this dynamic that's playing out. I think I haven't had a chance to look at the Technology Review article. I'll take a look at it now that you mention it.
The Indian VC market went through very frothy times for a couple of years, and I when I was looking out, maybe 3-4 years back, on how the Indian VC market was developing. Actually, early on, it was developing slower than I thought it would, And then I thought that, okay, well, maybe the Indian VC market it's generally conservative people. They're going to remain focused on fundamentals, and it is going to develop a bit slowly, but it will develop in a more healthy way. And then in the last 2 years, it went completely unhealthy, and it went to exactly the same kind of nonsense that we see in the Silicon Valley market. And then it kind of, this year, it has slowed down tremendously. How do you read all this? When can we expect to see something more sane and healthy?
So I think, one word describes it, the FOMO factor. This fear of missing out, I think, caught up it's been there in the Valley for a while. It's sort of caught up in India as well. I look at the Indian sort of VC market as the pre-e-commerce and the post-e-commerce sort of phase. Prior to the Flipkarts and the Snapdeals and Shop2 sort of getting created, there weren't so people were building businesses that were, as you said, in a much more sort of structured manner. Capital required. It was India, when it started, when we sort of went to raise a fund, our positioning was that India is a much lower cost sort of market. Right. The amount of capital required to build a company in India will be lower, and therefore we can do a smaller fund, and we can take companies along further without raising too much capital. So that was the original thesis, and I would say in our first fund, that sort of worked out. The second sort of phase, which is post e-commerce, I think it was driven partly by entry of hedge funds into India, and just a lot of capital going in, and that capital it sort of became a game of who has raised more capital rather than who has a better solution. And that unfortunately led to a lot of capital, in my view, being wasted. And that has led to what you are seeing now, which is, again, people haven't seen the kind of returns that you would expect from that much capital being deployed in the market. And people are now stepping back and saying, hey, do we need to go back and look at capital efficiency? The reason why India was attractive in the first place with capital efficiency, how do we drive businesses to think more around competitive differentiation based on product, based on quality of service, based on fit with customer requirements, rather than really being driven by capital.
Yeah, and it's a much healthier way of building companies. In our philosophy, and everything we do in this program is focused on capital efficient entrepreneurship, whether it's in India or elsewhere. We really don't believe in this raising crazy amounts of money, and then you become, you cannot get an exit if you raise too much money, and you're not able to deliver the metrics. You're not going to be able to exit. There aren't that many Facebooks and Salesforce.coms out there. So if you want to support a significant ecosystem, capital efficient entrepreneurship, I believe, is a much more reliable way of building businesses.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
All right, well, Sandeep, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your time and thoughts, and we'll keep in touch, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emma. Thanks for having me. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Folks,